The moment Bruce Lee stepped into the arena, thousands of people laughed. Not because he had lost, not because he had been knocked down, but because, in that moment, they believed he had no chance of winning. The entire arena was shaking with one name. Van Damme, Van Damme, Van Damme. The sound rolled through the enormous Los Angeles Stadium like thunder. Thousands of people were standing, some were waving signs, others were leaning over the railings, screaming toward the ring. Camera flashes exploded across the darkness, while the announcer stood beneath the brightest lights in the building, waiting for the crowd to calm down. It never did. Tonight belonged to Jean-Claude Van Damme. At least that was what everyone believed. He was the fighter people had come to see. Strong, athletic, explosive, and confident, Van Damme had become the name that filled arenas. His reputation had traveled far beyond Los Angeles. People talked about his kicks, his speed, his physical strength, and the way he could turn a fight around in a heartbeat. And tonight, thousands had paid to watch him do it again. The ring stood in the center of the arena, beneath a wall of white lights. 4 ropes, a blue canvas, a roaring crowd, and 2 empty corners waiting for the fighters. The announcer lifted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen." The crowd immediately erupted. The announcer waited. Then he smiled. Tonight, Los Angeles witnesses a special challenge. The cheering became louder. And now, the lights around the arena began to dim. A spotlight appeared at the entrance. The crowd knew what was coming. "Please welcome." A pause. Then the announcer shouted, "Jean-Claude Van Damme." The arena exploded. Van Damme. Van Damme. Van Damme. Van Damme stepped through the entrance. He wore a confident smile. He slowly walked toward the ring, looking from one side of the arena to the other. People were reaching toward him. Some were shouting his name. Some were filming him. Others were pounding on the barriers. Van Damme climbed the steps and entered the ring. He raised one hand. The response was deafening. For several seconds, it seemed as though the entire building belonged to him. Then the announcer raised the microphone again. But tonight, the crowd gradually became quieter. Van Damme will face a challenger unlike anyone he has faced before. People looked toward the entrance. The announcer continued. His opponent. A pause. Long enough for anticipation to fill the arena. Bruce Lee. Silence. For one strange second, nobody reacted. Then someone laughed. Another person laughed. Then another. Within moments, laughter spread through the arena. Not applause. Not excitement. Laughter. People looked at one another as if they had just heard the strangest joke imaginable. A man near the front shouted, "Bruce Lee." Another voice came from the upper seats. "Who brought this guy here?" A group of people began laughing. Someone yelled, "Is this a real fight?" More laughter. Then Bruce Lee appeared. He walked through the entrance wearing a simple black martial arts uniform. No dramatic entrance. No arrogant smile. No attempt to impress anyone. He simply walked, step by step, calmly, quietly. His eyes remained fixed on the ring. The arena continued laughing. A man in the front row shouted, "Hey Bruce, you sure you're in the right building?" The people around him laughed. Another spectator stood up. "Van Damme is going to destroy him." More laughter. Bruce heard every word, but he never turned his head. He continued walking. His expression was almost impossible to read. No anger, no fear, no nervousness, just concentration. As Bruce climbed the steps and entered the ring, Van Damme watched him carefully. The two men stood several feet apart. The noise continued. Van Damme looked at Bruce from head to toe. Then he smiled. "You know," he said quietly, "they're laughing because they don't understand why you're here." Bruce looked toward the crowd, then back at Van Damme. "They don't need to understand." Van Damme raised an eyebrow. Bruce continued, "They only need to watch." Van Damme smiled again. "You really believe you can beat me?" Bruce remained silent for a moment. Then he said, "Believing isn't what matters. What does? Being ready." Van Damme's smile disappeared for a second. There was something about Bruce's voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. That was what made it unsettling. Bruce wasn't trying to convince him. He sounded like a man who had already accepted whatever was about to happen. The referee stepped between them. He gave both fighters the instructions. "Protect yourself. Follow the rules. Wait for the bell." The crowd continued shouting, "Van Damme! Van Damme!" Bruce returned to his corner. He closed his eyes for a moment. The noise around him seemed to disappear. The lights, the crowd, the shouting, everything faded. He breathed slowly. One breath, then another. Across the ring, Van Damme bounced lightly on his feet. He looked ready. He looked confident. He looked like the man everyone expected to win. The referee looked at both fighters, then stepped backward. The arena became silent. For the first time that night, thousands of people were waiting for the same sound. Ding! The bell rang, and everything changed. Van Damme moved first. Fast, much faster than the crowd expected. He crossed the distance in an instant and fired a powerful punch toward Bruce's face. The crowd reacted. But Bruce wasn't there. He had moved. Barely. His head shifted only a few inches. Van Damme's fist passed through empty air. The crowd became quieter. Van Damme immediately followed with another strike. Bruce moved again. A kick came next. Bruce stepped away. Another punch. Bruce slipped past it. Another kick. Bruce blocked it. Van Damme stopped. For a fraction of a second, his expression changed. Bruce was watching him, not reacting late. Watching, as though every movement had already been expected. Van Damme attacked again. One punch. Two. Three. Bruce moved between them with astonishing precision. The crowd that had been laughing only moments earlier began to quiet down. A man in the front row leaned forward. "What is he doing?" Another spectator answered. "He's reading him." Van Damme heard the crowd becoming quieter. That seemed to make him more aggressive. He stepped forward and launched a combination. Punchy, punchy, kick. Bruce blocked the first, avoided the second, moved outside the kick. Then suddenly, Bruce stepped forward. A short, incredibly fast strike landed against Van Damme's body. Not enough to knock him down. Enough to make him stop. The arena went silent. Bruce returned to his stance. Van Damme looked at him. Bruce said nothing. Van Damme breathed heavily through his nose. Then he nodded. "Okay." The smile was gone. He came forward again. This time, there was no hesitation. Van Damme attacked with everything he had. Bruce moved backward. 1 step. 2. 3. Van Damme kept coming. The crowd began shouting again. Van Damme. Van Damme. Finish him. Bruce's back approached the ropes. The spectators thought they saw the opening. A man screamed. Now! Van Damme stepped forward. Bruce was trapped. At least that's what everyone thought. Van Damme raised his leg. A powerful kick came toward Bruce. At the last possible moment, Bruce lowered his body. The kick passed above him. Bruce rotated around Van Damme. For a split second, Van Damme lost sight of him. He turned. Bruce was already behind him. The crowd gasped. Bruce could have attacked. Instead, he stepped away. Van Damme turned completely. Their eyes met. And something changed. Van Damme finally understood. Bruce wasn't trying to survive. He was studying him. Every movement, every habit, every mistake, every opening. Bruce wasn't fighting the man everyone else saw. He was learning the man underneath. Van Damme wiped sweat from his forehead. Then he smiled. Not the arrogant smile from the beginning. A different smile. The smile of a fighter who had finally found something worth respecting. You're fast, Van Damme said. Bruce answered. Speed is useless if you don't know when to use it. The crowd murmured. The referee looked between them. The first round continued. Van Damme attacked again. Bruce countered. Van Damme blocked. Bruce moved. The pace became faster. The two fighters crossed the ring repeatedly. The audience could barely follow their movements. Every time Van Damme seemed to corner Bruce, Bruce slipped away. Every time Bruce appeared to have an opening, Van Damme recovered. Neither man was willing to give the other control. The laughter had completely disappeared. Now people were standing. Not because they were cheering. Because they didn't want to miss a second. Then Van Damme suddenly changed direction. He faked a punch. Bruce reacted. Van Damme immediately fired a kick from the opposite side. This time, it connected. Bruce's body moved backward. The crowd exploded. Van Damme shouted as he advanced. Bruce regained his balance. Van Damme came again. Another punch. Bruce blocked. Another. Bruce moved. A third strike landed against Bruce's shoulder. Bruce stepped back. For the first time, the crowd believed they had seen the beginning of the end. Van Damme. Van Damme. Finish it. Van Damme rushed forward. Bruce looked at him. And then something unexpected happened. Bruce smiled. Just slightly. Van Damme noticed. He slowed for half a second. Why are you smiling? Bruce answered quietly. Because now I know. Know what? Bruce raised his hands. Your rhythm. Van Damme's eyes narrowed. Then he attacked. Bruce moved. But this time, he didn't simply retreat. He stepped directly toward him. The two fighters collided in the center of the ring. Punches flashed. Blocks slammed together. Feet struck the canvas. The sound echoed through the arena. The crowd went wild. Van Damme threw a combination. Bruce blocked the first. Avoided the second. Redirected the third. Then Bruce fired a rapid counter. Van Damme stumbled backward. One step. Two. His heel nearly touched the edge of the canvas. The crowd gasped. Bruce stopped. He didn't chase him. Van Damme looked at Bruce. For the first time that night, there was uncertainty in his eyes. Not fear. Respect. The bell suddenly rang. Ding! The first round was over. The crowd erupted. Van Damme walked toward his corner. Bruce walked toward his. Neither fighter looked at the audience. Neither celebrated. The arena was alive with confusion. The people who had laughed at Bruce only minutes earlier were now asking the same question. Who exactly had just stepped into that ring? A commentator near the ringside microphone whispered. I don't think Van Damme expected this. His partner answered. No, I don't think anyone did. Bruce sat in his corner. His trainer handed him water. Bruce took a small sip. Across the ring, Van Damme listened to his own corner. His coach spoke quickly. Don't chase him, make him come to you. Van Damme nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Bruce. Bruce looked back. Neither man smiled. The arena lights reflected off the sweat on their faces. The second round was coming, and somewhere in the crowd, the same people who had laughed the loudest were beginning to realize something uncomfortable. The fight they had expected to be easy was becoming something completely different. The referee called the fighters back. Bruce stood. Van Damme stood. The crowd rose with them. The noise returned. But this time, there was something different in it. There was anticipation. The bell had not yet rung. Thousands of people were holding their breath. Bruce slowly raised his hands. Van Damme did the same. They stared at each other. And neither man knew that the next few minutes would turn the entire arena upside down. Because the first round had only answered one question. Bruce Lee could survive Van Damme. The second round was about to reveal something far more dangerous. Could Bruce Lee actually defeat him? The bell rang, and Bruce stepped forward first. The bell rang again, and this time Bruce Lee did not wait. He stepped forward, not quickly, not recklessly, calmly, deliberately. The entire arena seemed to lean toward the ring. Only minutes earlier, thousands of people had been laughing at the man in black. Now nobody laughed. Van Damme stood across from him, breathing steadily, his eyes locked on Bruce. The first round had changed something. Bruce had not dominated him. Van Damme had not dominated Bruce. But both men had discovered that the other was far more dangerous than expected. The referee stepped away. Bruce raised his hands. Van Damme raised his. Then Bruce whispered, "Let's finish what we started." Van Damme nodded. "Now you're talking." Bruce moved. Van Damme moved at exactly the same moment. The distance between them disappeared. A punch flashed toward Bruce's face. Bruce tilted his head. The fist missed by inches. Bruce answered with a short strike. Van Damme blocked it. Another. Blocked. A kick came from Van Damme. Bruce lifted his leg and intercepted it. The impact echoed through the arena. Thud. The crowd gasped. Van Damme immediately spun. Bruce ducked. The kick passed over his head. Bruce stepped inside. For a fraction of a second, the two men were almost chest to chest. Van Damme threw a short punch. Bruce redirected it. Bruce attempted a counter. Van Damme blocked. Neither man gave ground. The crowd began shouting again. But this time there was no mocking, no laughter, no insults, only excitement. Buce. Van Damme. The two names began mixing together throughout the arena. Bruce attacked. Van Damme defended. Van Damme attacked. Bruce slipped away. It was becoming less like a fight between a famous fighter and an unknown challenger, and more like a battle between two completely different philosophies. Van Damme believed in explosive power. Bruce believed in timing. Van Damme attacked like a storm. Bruce moved like water. And every time Van Damme thought he had finally trapped him, Bruce seemed to disappear. Van Damme suddenly stepped backward. Bruce stopped. They stared at one another. Van Damme breathed heavily. Bruce's chest was rising and falling too. Sweat ran down the side of his face. Neither man looked fresh anymore. The fight was taking its toll. Van Damme wiped his mouth. "You're not as easy as I thought." Bruce gave a faint smile. "I could say the same." The crowd reacted with laughter. But this time, the laughter wasn't directed at Bruce. It was nervous laughter. The kind people make when they realize they are watching something they didn't expect. Van Damme suddenly charged. Bruce moved left. Van Damme changed direction. Bruce moved right. Van Damme threw a kick. Bruce blocked. The impact forced Bruce backward. Van Damme followed immediately. Punch. Bruce blocked. Another punch. Bruce slipped. A third strike. Bruce took it on his shoulder. The crowd erupted. Van Damme saw the opening. He attacked again. Bruce moved backward. One step. 2. 3. His heel touched the edge of the ring. The audience came alive. "Now, get a HIM. Van Damme." Van Damme raised his leg. He launched a powerful kick. Bruce lowered his body. The kick missed. But Van Damme had expected that. He immediately turned. A second kick came from the opposite direction. This one connected against Bruce's side. Bruce stumbled. The crowd exploded. Van Damme didn't stop. He rushed forward. Bruce's back touched the ropes. Van Damme threw a punch. Bruce blocked. Another. Bruce moved. Another. Bruce absorbed part of the impact. Van Damme pushed him harder. The ropes shook behind Bruce. Thousands of spectators stood. A man near ringside shouted, "He's got HIM." Another yelled, "Don't let HIM out." Van Damme raised his fist. Bruce looked directly into his eyes. For 1 second, everything slowed down. The crowd disappeared. The lights disappeared. There was only Bruce and Van Damme. Van Damme threw the punch. Bruce moved. The fist passed beside his face. Bruce stepped outside the attack. Then something happened that nobody expected. Bruce grabbed Van Damme's wrist for only a fraction of a second. He redirected the momentum. Van Damme's body turned. Bruce released him. Van Damme stumbled forward. Bruce was already behind him. The crowd gasped. Van Damme turned. Bruce was standing several feet away. Waiting. Not attacking. Waiting. Van Damme stared at him. "You could have hit me." Bruce nodded. "I know. Why didn't you?" Bruce answered. Because you weren't ready. Van Damme's expression changed. Those words hit harder than a punch. For the first time, Van Damme realized that Bruce wasn't fighting emotionally. Bruce wasn't trying to prove he was better. He was fighting because he understood something Van Damme hadn't yet understood. The fight wasn't about strength. It was about control. Van Damme clenched his fists. Then let's see what happens when I am. He attacked. Harder than before. Faster than before. Bruce's eyes narrowed. The pace became terrifying. Van Damme threw combination after combination. Bruce blocked, moved, countered. Van Damme pressed forward. Bruce slipped away. The two men moved so quickly that even the cameras struggled to keep up. The audience was screaming. A punch, a block, a kick, a counter, a spinning strike, a dodge, a sudden step forward. Bruce's fist stopped inches from Van Damme's face. Van Damme's kick stopped inches from Bruce's chest. Both men froze. The crowd went silent. They were breathing heavily. Their faces were only inches apart. Van Damme smiled. "You're enjoying this?" Bruce answered. "I'm learning." "Learning what?" Bruce looked at him. "How to beat you." Van Damme's smile disappeared. Then he attacked with everything he had. The next exchange was the fastest of the night. Van Damme threw a punch. Bruce blocked. Van Damme kicked. Bruce moved. Van Damme spun. Bruce ducked. Bruce countered. Van Damme blocked. Bruce attacked again. Van Damme stumbled backward. Bruce advanced. Van Damme fired another kick. Bruce caught the movement and stepped away. Van Damme turned. Bruce was already beside him. A short strike landed. Van Damme's head snapped slightly to the side. The arena gasped. Van Damme took a step backward. Bruce didn't chase. Van Damme touched his cheek. Then he looked at Bruce. For the first time that night, there was no confidence on his face. There was respect. But respect wasn't going to make him surrender. He charged again. Bruce waited. Van Damme launched a devastating combination. Bruce moved through it. Not backward. Forward. The audience screamed. Bruce entered the space between the attacks. One strike. 2. 3. Van Damme blocked the first. The second touched his body. The third forced him backward. Van Damme nearly lost his balance. He caught himself. Bruce stood in front of him. The crowd was completely silent. A commentator whispered, "Van Damme is being forced to fight differently." His partner answered, "Because Bruce isn't giving him the fight he expected." Van Damme looked toward his corner. His trainer shouted, "Don't chase him." But Van Damme didn't hear it. Or perhaps he heard it and ignored it. He wanted to prove something. To Bruce, to himself, and to everyone watching. He stepped forward again. Bruce saw it. He saw the anger. He saw the impatience. And he knew exactly what was coming. Van Damme attacked. Bruce moved backward. Van Damme followed. Bruce moved again. Van Damme followed. Again. Again. Bruce was leading him somewhere. Van Damme didn't realize it. The crowd did not realize it. Bruce was slowly getting him toward the center of the ring. Then Van Damme suddenly stopped. He understood. "You've been controlling where I move. Bruce said nothing. Van Damme smiled. You've been doing that since the first round. Bruce nodded. Van Damme shook his head. That's clever. Bruce raised his hands. But clever won't win this. Van Damme exploded forward. Bruce met him halfway. The collision was violent. Their arms crashed together. The sound echoed across the arena. Bruce took a strike to the ribs. Van Damme took a strike to the chest. Neither backed away. They traded blow after blow. The audience couldn't believe what they were seeing. The famous Van Damme was standing toe-to-toe with the supposedly unknown Bruce Lee. And Bruce wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was fighting. The two men became shadows beneath the bright arena lights. Sweat flew from their faces. Their breathing became heavier. The canvas beneath their feet became covered with footprints. Then Van Damme landed a clean strike. Bruce stumbled. The crowd screamed. Bruce took 2 steps backward. Van Damme rushed forward. He saw the opportunity. He believed it was finally there. The moment he had been waiting for. He raised his leg. The crowd roared. Bruce looked up. And then, Bruce moved. Not backward. Forward. Van Damme's kick passed beside him. Bruce stepped inside. He struck. Van Damme's body reacted. His balance disappeared. His knee touched the canvas for a split second. The arena went silent. Van Damme pushed himself back up immediately. Bruce didn't celebrate. He simply waited. Van Damme stood. They looked at one another. Something had changed again. Now Van Damme knew. Bruce could hurt him. Bruce knew it too. But there was still one thing neither man had shown. Their final level. The referee checked both fighters. Continue. Van Damme nodded. Bruce nodded. The referee stepped away. The crowd began chanting. BRUCE. Then another section answered. Van Damme. The chants collided. Bruce and Van Damme stood in the center of the ring. The lights above them seemed brighter. The entire arena was standing. No one was sitting anymore. No one was laughing. The man who had shouted earlier, Ringden Tirik Chiksa Ham Omid, was now gripping the railing with both hands. He wasn't laughing. He was watching Bruce with wide eyes. Then the bell rang. Ding! Van Damme attacked first. Bruce countered. Van Damme blocked. Bruce moved. Van Damme spun. Bruce ducked. Bruce stepped forward. Van Damme struck. Bruce absorbed it. Bruce answered. Van Damme stumbled. The crowd erupted. But Van Damme didn't fall. He straightened. He wiped blood from the corner of his lip. Then he looked at Bruce. You're going to have to do better than that. Bruce breathed slowly. I was about to say the same thing. The crowd roared. Van Damme smiled. Bruce smiled. And then both fighters charged. They collided in the center of the ring. The next sequence happened so quickly that later, people would argue about exactly what they had seen. Van Damme threw a punch. Bruce slipped. Van Damme threw another. Bruce blocked. Van Damme kicked. Bruce moved. Bruce countered. Van Damme blocked. Bruce stepped forward. Van Damme stepped backward. Bruce attacked. Van Damme recovered. Then suddenly, Van Damme landed a devastating strike. Bruce's body was thrown backward. The crowd screamed. Bruce hit the canvas. For the first time all night, Bruce Lee was down. Silence. Absolute silence. Van Damme stood over him. The referee immediately stepped forward. The crowd watched. Bruce didn't move. 1 second. 2. 3. The man everyone had laughed at was lying on the canvas. The announcer whispered, "Could this be the moment?" The referee began counting. 1. The arena held its breath. 2. Van Damme stepped backward. 3. Bruce's fingers moved. 4. The crowd began to murmur. 5. Bruce opened his eyes. 6. He placed one hand against the canvas. 7. Bruce pushed himself upward. 8. One knee. 9. Bruce stood. The arena exploded. Thousands of people screamed. Bruce lifted his head. He looked at Van Damme. Van Damme's expression changed. Because Bruce was smiling. Not because he wasn't hurt. He was. Not because he wasn't tired. He was exhausted. Bruce was smiling because he had just discovered something. Something that would change the final round. Van Damme had finally shown him the one movement Bruce had been waiting to see. Bruce slowly raised his hands. Van Damme did the same. The referee looked at both men. The audience was screaming. And then Bruce whispered something so quietly that almost nobody heard it. "Now." He took one step forward. "I know how this ends." The bell rang, and the final round began. But this time, Bruce Lee wasn't simply trying to survive. He was coming for the victory. And Jean-Claude Van Damme had no idea that the man he had once considered an easy opponent had spent the entire fight preparing for one final move. One move. One opening. One moment. And when that moment finally came, the entire arena would witness it. The final bell rang. For a moment, neither man moved. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the ring, breathing heavily. Jean-Claude Van Damme stood across from him, his chest rising and falling with every breath. Both men were exhausted. Both were bruised. Both knew that there was nowhere left to hide. There would be no more testing. No more studying. No more waiting. This was the moment. The moment the entire arena had been waiting for. Thousands of people stood around them. The same people who had laughed when Bruce first walked into the building were now completely silent. Nobody was mocking him. Nobody was calling him a nobody. Nobody was asking why he was there. They were watching him. Every single person. Van Damme wiped the sweat from his forehead. Then he looked directly at Bruce. "You said you knew how this ends." Bruce nodded. "I do." Van Damme smiled. "Then show me." Bruce lowered his hands for a moment. The arena became even quieter. Then he raised them again. The referee stepped backward. The crowd held its breath. And Van Damme attacked. He exploded forward with everything he had left. A powerful punch came toward Bruce's face. Bruce slipped to the side. Another punch. Bruce blocked. A kick. Bruce moved backward. Van Damme followed. Another kick. Bruce jumped away. Van Damme didn't stop. He was fighting with desperation now. Every movement carried the weight of the entire night. Bruce moved around him. Van Damme attacked. Bruce avoided. Van Damme attacked again. Bruce blocked. Then Van Damme landed a clean strike against Bruce's ribs. Bruce staggered. The crowd erupted. Van Damme rushed forward. Bruce barely recovered. Another strike came. Bruce moved his head. The punch missed. Van Damme turned. Bruce was already there. Bruce fired a rapid counter. Van Damme blocked it. The two men separated. Both were breathing heavily. The audience was screaming. BRUCE. Van Damme. BRUCE. Van Damme. The chants became impossible to distinguish. For the first time that night, the arena wasn't divided between a favorite and an unknown challenger. They were witnessing two fighters who had earned the respect of everyone inside the building. Van Damme looked at Bruce. Bruce looked back. Neither man moved. Then Van Damme said, "You're still standing." Bruce answered, "So are you." Van Damme laughed quietly. "Then let's see who falls first." Bruce nodded. "Fair enough." They stepped forward. The final battle began. Van Damme threw a combination. Bruce blocked. Van Damme changed direction. Bruce moved. Van Damme kicked. Bruce caught the movement and stepped away. Bruce countered. Van Damme blocked. Another strike. Van Damme slipped. Bruce attacked. Van Damme backed away. The speed became unbelievable. The audience was screaming so loudly that the announcers could barely speak. Then Van Damme suddenly changed his rhythm. Bruce noticed. The same movement. The same setup. The same attack that had knocked Bruce down moments earlier. Bruce's eyes narrowed. Van Damme charged. He threw the first strike. Bruce moved. Van Damme followed with the second. Bruce blocked. Then came the kick. The exact kick. The same angle. The same timing. But this time Bruce was ready. He had been waiting for it. Bruce stepped inside the attack. Van Damme's kick passed beside him. Bruce turned his body. One movement. One counter. One perfectly timed strike. Van Damme lost his balance. The arena gasped. But he didn't fall. He caught himself. Bruce didn't rush. He waited. Van Damme looked at him. Then smiled. "You finally figured it out." Bruce nodded. "I told you." "What?" "You showed me." Van Damme's smile disappeared. Then he attacked again. Bruce was ready. The two fighters collided. Punches flashed. Feet moved. Bodies turned. The ring seemed too small for them. Van Damme struck. Bruce slipped. Bruce countered. Van Damme blocked. Van Damme attacked. Bruce moved. Bruce countered. Van Damme stumbled. Bruce advanced. The crowd rose even higher. The man who had been laughing earlier was now screaming Bruce's name. BRUCE. 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 Bruce heard it. But he didn't look at the audience. His eyes remained on Van Damme. The fight continued. Van Damme was exhausted. Bruce was exhausted. But neither man wanted to stop. Van Damme suddenly stepped backward. He lowered his hands. For a moment, Bruce stopped too. Van Damme breathed deeply. Then he said, "I've never fought anyone like you." Bruce answered, "I've never fought anyone who kept coming after taking that many hits." Van Damme smiled. That means we're even. Bruce smiled back. Maybe. Then Van Damme raised his hands. Last exchange. Bruce nodded. Last exchange. The crowd sensed what was happening. The arena became almost completely silent. Thousands of people were watching two exhausted fighters standing in the center of the ring. No shouting. No music. No celebration. Just two men. Two fighters. Two wills. Van Damme took a breath. Bruce did the same. Then, they moved. Van Damme came forward first. Faster than anyone expected from a fighter who had already spent so much energy. He threw a punch. Bruce moved. Van Damme followed. Bruce blocked. Van Damme spun. Bruce ducked. Van Damme landed a strike against Bruce's shoulder. Bruce staggered. Van Damme attacked again. Bruce moved backward. One step. Two. Three. The crowd began shouting. Van Damme saw the opening. He stepped forward. Bruce's back was almost touching the ropes. The same position. The same trap. The same moment from earlier. Van Damme raised his leg. The audience erupted. Finish HIM. But Bruce remained calm. He remembered the first round. He remembered the second. He remembered every movement. Every kick. Every punch. Every mistake. Every pattern. And then he saw it. The smallest opening. Less than a second. Van Damme launched the kick. Bruce moved. Not backward. Forward. He stepped inside the attack. Van Damme's balance shifted. Bruce redirected his momentum. Van Damme spun. Bruce followed. One precise counter. Van Damme's body lost balance. He fell. Bam! The arena froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Van Damme was on the canvas. Bruce stood several feet away. The referee rushed forward. 1. Van Damme didn't move. 2. Bruce looked at him. 3. The audience was silent. 4. Van Damme's hand moved. 5. He pushed against the canvas. 6. One knee came up. 7. Van Damme tried to stand. 8. He rose halfway. 9. He reached his feet. The arena exploded. Van Damme was standing, but he was unsteady. The referee looked at him. Can you continue? Van Damme looked across the ring. Bruce stood waiting. Van Damme took a breath, then nodded. Yes. The crowd roared. Bruce nodded respectfully. The referee stepped between them. But before he could restart the action, Van Damme raised one hand. Wait. The arena became quiet. Van Damme looked toward Bruce, then toward the referee, then toward the audience. He took a long breath and said, I've had enough. The crowd went silent. The referee looked surprised. Van Damme turned toward Bruce. You bait me. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Then the announcer raised the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen. He paused. The winner. The entire arena held its breath. Bruce. The building exploded. Thousands of people jumped to their feet. The sound was overwhelming. But this time there was no laughter. No doubt. No mocking. Only one name. Bruce. 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 Bruce stood in the center of the ring. He looked around. The lights were shining directly on him. Sweat covered his face. His chest was still rising and falling. His body was exhausted. But his eyes were calm. The same calm eyes that had appeared in the arena when nobody knew who he was. The same eyes that had watched thousands of people laugh. The same eyes that had refused to answer the insults. Now the entire arena was screaming his name. Bruce slowly lowered his head. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Then he opened them. Van Damme walked toward him. The crowd became quieter. Van Damme stood directly in front of Bruce. The two men stared at each other. Neither spoke. Then Van Damme extended his hand. Bruce looked at it. Then took it. They shook hands. Van Damme leaned closer. You know what the strangest part is? Bruce smiled. What? Van Damme looked around the arena. They were laughing at you. Bruce nodded. I remember. And now? Van Damme turned toward the crowd. Thousands of people were still chanting Bruce's name. They won't stop saying it. Bruce looked at the audience. Then back at Van Damme. They don't have to remember me. Van Damme frowned slightly. What do you mean? Bruce answered quietly. They only have to remember what they learned tonight. Van Damme smiled. You really don't care about the fame, do you? Bruce shook his head. No. Then what do you fight for? Bruce looked toward the crowd. He waited, then said, to become better than the man I was yesterday. Van Damme nodded slowly. That, he smiled. I can respect. The two men embraced briefly. The audience erupted again. Cameras flashed. People stood on their seats. Some were shouting Bruce's name. Others were shouting Van Damme's. But something had changed. This was no longer about one fighter defeating another. It was about respect. The man everyone had expected to win had lost. But he had not been humiliated. He had discovered an opponent worthy of respect. And the man nobody had expected to win had earned something much greater than a victory. He had earned the respect of an entire arena. Bruce climbed out of the ring. As he walked toward the exit, he passed the same front-row spectator who had shouted, "Is this a real fight?" The man stood frozen. Bruce looked at him. The spectator swallowed. Then he stood up and applauded. Bruce stopped for a moment. He nodded, then continued walking. The man looked down. His face had changed. He had laughed at Bruce when Bruce entered. Now he was standing to honor him. And that was happening all across the arena. People who had mocked him were standing. People who had doubted him were applauding. People who had never heard his name were now shouting it. Bruce. Bruce reached the arena entrance. He stopped. For one final moment, he looked back. The lights, the crowd, the ring, Van Damme standing in the center. Everything seemed almost unreal. Bruce smiled, then walked away. But the story wasn't really about who won the fight. It was about what happened before the fight. Because anyone can cheer for a champion after he wins. The harder thing is believing in yourself when nobody else does. Bruce had entered that arena as a stranger. Thousands had laughed. Thousands had doubted. Thousands had believed he had no chance. But he never fought them. He never argued with them. He never tried to convince them. He simply stepped into the ring and let his actions speak. That night, the crowd learned something they would never forget. Never mistake silence for weakness. A quiet person may be preparing. A calm person may be calculating. And the person everyone underestimates may be the person capable of surprising everyone. Bruce Lee didn't need the arena to believe in him before the fight. He needed only one person to believe: himself. And when the final bell rang, the same arena that had once laughed at him was screaming his name. The same people who had called him a nobody were standing on their feet. The same crowd that had believed Van Damme would destroy him had witnessed something they never expected. Not just a victory, a transformation. Bruce Lee walked into the arena as an unknown challenger. He walked out carrying something far more valuable than a trophy: respect. And Jean-Claude Van Damme. He walked away defeated, but not broken, because sometimes losing a fight doesn't make you smaller. Sometimes it introduces you to someone who changes the way you understand fighting itself. That night, two fighters entered the ring. One was the favorite. The other was the man nobody believed in. But when it was over, the crowd understood that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, greatness walks quietly through an arena, wearing black, saying almost nothing, and waiting for the moment when actions become louder than every voice in the crowd. The final image of the night was simple: Bruce Lee walking toward the exit, Van Damme standing behind him, thousands of people still cheering, "Buce, Buce, Buce." And Bruce never turned around, because he already knew something the crowd had only just discovered. You don't have to be recognized before you prove yourself. You don't need everyone to believe in you. You don't need applause before you begin. Sometimes, you simply need the courage to step into the ring when everyone else thinks you've already lost. And that night in Los Angeles, the man nobody knew walked into the arena. But the man who walked out was impossible to forget. Bruce Lee, the name they laughed at, the fighter they underestimated, and the man who made an entire arena stand.